Ethereum 2.0 Genesis is less than a month away. We understand that it is essential to talk about ETH2 and the features that it may bring for the Ethereum chain. A huge section of the blockchain community could use the better understanding of Ethereum 1.0 and 2.0 chains. Keeping that in mind, we invited someone very special from Ethereum 2.0 development team to talk about EIP-2982 SERENITY Phase 0. This is an informational EIP created on September 15 and currently is merged as draft. According to the summary provided in the EIP, this EIP addresses Phase 0 and would be executed without any breaking changes, bringing to consensus on the Ethereum mainnet. To know more about the proposal and plans for it, moving along the EIP standardization process, let's invite our guest, Danny Ryan. Welcome, Danny.
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. I'm going to share my screen and then I'll talk a little bit about myself and then get going and we can dig into this EIP. If y'all have questions along the way, I'm happy to answer them, and we can also have a discussion at the end. Let's see. Okay, can you see EIP on the left?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, as Pooja mentioned, I'm one of the co-authors of EIP-2982, entitled SERENITY Phase 0. My name is Danny Ryan. I work with the Ethereum Foundation on the research team. I work on some research, some spec writing, a lot of coordination and things around which ultimately is kind of the upgrade of Ethereum's core consensus. And we are moving towards mainnet with this initial phase, and I'll get into that. And this EIP kind of represents that bundled into one thing. A little bit more about myself in case you care. I live in Colorado, hang out if I'm not on my computer working on this stuff. I try to hike, and I have 2 cats, one of which will probably join us at some point. I've been working on this stuff for years now. I did work on a similar specification almost 3 years ago, I guess 2.5 years ago, EIP-1011, Casper FFG, a proof of stake protocol, and a hybrid mechanism with proof of stake and proof of work to existing Ethereum mainnet. That was scrapped more than 2 years ago in favor of what we are working on launching right now, which is this more, it is a more ambitious project, but I think a more sustainable and a better project. So that's what we're calling SERENITY. That's what's often called ETH2, and we can dive in. So first of all, if you follow the EIP process, or if you've seen any of these other Peep and EIPs, you're familiar with the fact that EIPs have a type. And the most common type, I think, is core, which these are changes that actually bring in consensus changes to the Ethereum mainnet. There are ERCs, which are requests for comments. These are more like standards for how to build things or interact with things. There's probably more, but there's also this informational one. And this informational one, which is the type of EIP-2982, is not actually used very much. And it's really to provide information and doesn't really solicit. Actually, I'll pull it up right now. Right, so it's a design issue, provides general guidelines or just information to the community. Whereas core is something that actually affects implementations, consensus, if it does go to mainnet. And you have all these other ones, meta, interface, networking, fun stuff. But we're one of the 5 informational. And this was actually a bit of a debate as to, I initially posted this as core in the sense that the argument is that the changes that we propose, the extensions to the protocol that we propose, will eventually affect Ethereum mainnet. But the pushback is that by design, the initial phases of ETH2 do not affect Ethereum mainnet. And so this doesn't really, and so instead, because of the way that we're bootstrapping this new consensus mechanism in parallel to existing Ethereum, and that does not initially disrupt Ethereum mainnet at all or alter consensus, that this is an informational EIP. Then you can check out the initial pull request. It's a bit of a hot topic debate. And I think people were generally happy with informational, although there was a debate, and I can get into this. This is more about like specifications as to whether this should have even been an EIP. So we didn't intend to drop anything controversial here, but it is a strange EIP for a number of reasons. One of which is that it is an informational thing, even though it's intended to affect mainnet eventually. And the other is the specifications. We can get into that later. So I have the EIP pulled up here. Dropped it 9/15/2020. There's some discussions on Ethereum magicians. There was actually more discussions on the actual EIP repo in the pull request. And there's probably often a balance between discussions here. Like the discussions in the Ethereum magicians are maybe a little bit more high level, whereas dynamic discussions in the pull request are more like, well, think about this line, maybe move this stuff here. But there was also some kind of existential debate as to whether this should be an EIP or how it should be structured in general there. So you can check that out. And as Pooja said, this is a draft, and I'll talk about kind of the status and the path there in a bit. So I will have a presentation going on over here, and I will highlight and point to some of the actual EIP along the way. So there's kind of a proposed structure. If you don't follow the proposed structure, the editors will probably say, why the hell didn't you follow the proposed structure, and make suggestions so that you follow it. So if you're writing EIP, just follow the proposed structure. First of all is the simple summary. The TLDR is this is an initial phase of a multi-phase upgrade of Ethereum's core consensus. I note here that it's long planned. If you look at some of the early writings about Ethereum, finding Ethereum a more sustainable and scalable consensus algorithm for its final destination has been discussed since early on, and that's been called SERENITY on the original roadmap. And what this does is breaks up the upgrade of SERENITY into a number of phases, and this is kind of the initial bootstrapping, I say that right here, of this new consensus mechanism in parallel to the existing proof of work, but with the intention that as the Ethereum's consensus mechanism in the future. So a simple summary, nothing crazy. We're trying to get proof of stake out. Simple summary says that. The abstract is a little bit more technical. It says more concretely, it repeats some of the stuff in that it's like is of this consensus mechanism, but it actually goes more concretely to discuss like what actually is accomplished in phase 0. And this really is the proof of stake consensus. It's the bootstrapping of that. And there's really two key algorithms. There's a lot of fine details in terms of the management of validators and accounting and state and hashing and all sorts of fun stuff. But really what we're trying to accomplish is consensus algorithms that kind of interact with each other. The first is FFG, the Friendly Finality Gadget, which is a proof of stake kind of Byzantine fault tolerant algorithm that provides accountable safety in the event that cohorts of validators try to do evil things. Accountable safety meaning that if you do something nefarious, we can prove it and your money can be burned. LMD-GHOST, which is really the driven, greedy, heaviest observed subtree. And this is just a fancy way to find the head of the chain. Essentially in any blockchain algorithm, blockchain protocol, we have a chain, but we don't actually just have a chain. We have more of like a tree, and we find a single chain. What we all agree on is the head of the chain and is the state of the world. In proof of work, that's relatively simple. You just find the heaviest chain, the chain with the most work. In proof we have to use validator votes and weight and stake and weights and things to find the head of a chain, and that algorithm is called LMD-GHOST. So really what we're trying to accomplish here is the execution of these algorithms in a live environment. And my cat has joined us. Hey, Tycho. Cool. So I also, kind of a strange part of this EIP is that a lot of work has gone into this, both in research, specifications, implementations. And so a lot of what happens in this EIP is I'm referencing, I give a TLDR and I reference the work. So, I note that the in-depth specifications are in, that there's this paper and actually a number of papers that discuss these algorithms more in depth. So I use this EIP as a way to kind of pull a lot of these references into one place and have something very concrete that we can point to and discuss as we move towards mainnet. So the motivation, if you follow Ethereum at all, the motivation was probably pretty obvious. I put, and his name is Inflation Causer, which I thought was a pretty funny name. But anyway, circa, was that 2017? I don't even know, 2018? I think it's 2017. The first large mainstream-ish dApp that made it to Ethereum and had a lot of usage is called CryptoKitties. All of a sudden, some of the scaling problems that we're going to run into and researchers and some developers were aware of, we become abundantly obvious to the Ethereum community and to the larger blockchain community. And so getting Ethereum into a more sustainable place to be able to handle a more global scale became incredibly pressing. And myself and a number of others have been spending solutions. So the motivation really is to be able to support an efficient global scale general purpose transactional platform while retaining high crypto economic security and decentralization. We won't get into the finer details of all those things, but essentially we want this thing to be centralized, we want it to be secure, and we want to be able to handle a lot of load. We quite frankly can't handle that today on Ethereum. And since early days in Ethereum, there's been discussion protocol to handle this and to explore layer 2 things such as channels and rollups and all that kind of stuff to get to this end goal. In my opinion, and I think most these days, it's going to be a combination of the two to get us to that global scale. And so what this EIP aims to do is to kind of take the step forward towards layer 1 being able to handle more scale. And there's two things in that efficient global scale general purpose transaction platform, security and decentralization, is scaling through sharding. So essentially to be able to handle more load at layer 1 without sacrificing decentralization, and decentralization and economic finality. So some what we think are some nicer properties and more sustainable properties by migrating to proof of stake rather than proof of work. So I put the very high level TLDRs here. Essentially proof of stake, decentralization, security, energy efficiency, get rid of that all that wasteful mining, and sharding, scale while retaining decentralization. Essentially, you can scale up a block, mentioned this in the EIP, just by making blocks bigger, just by making it really hard to run a full node. And that, I think, is kind of in our core tenets, sacrifices decentralization. So we want consumer machines to be able to validate the protocol. And thus, we do this thing called sharding, where we break up validation of the protocol into smaller chunks such that anyone can validate protocol and have guarantees about other portions that they're maybe not necessarily validating. So anyway, motivation, essentially we want scalable Ethereum. And we discussed a little bit here, and we also link to some resources. The Ethereum sharding wiki or sharding FAQ is pretty badass. Check it out. Similarly, the proof of stake FAQ is also badass. Like, if into these, it's very, very human readable and digestible, or as opposed to maybe some of the papers that are linked to here. So check it out. Cool. Moving on, we get into the specification section. And this actually ended up being a controversial component of this EIP. EIP editors consider EIPs to be homes for specs. But what we've been doing for multiple years now is developing ETH2 specifications in an independent repo, in the ETH2 specs repo. It's like, this is like my home. I live in this repo. I spend a lot of time here, but we have specifications for Z0, subsequent phases, and integrations and cool stuff. And we have the ability to have like very dynamic conversations and in-depth discussions over pull requests and code changes and spec changes. So in terms of where to write these specs, this independent repo separate of the EIP has been kind of it was an obvious choice. It worked really well. But to kind of ground this specification, because that's where people look to see what's going on in Ethereum and specs and things, we decided to write this, what became an informational EIP, with some of the core details for discussion and understanding, and some of the core specifications, some of these like key parameters for kind of a place of reference, but to not actually port the entirety of the specifications. The specifications are big and complex into this. And this was some debate as to whether EIPs should be used for this. I think that the conclusion was not, there isn't necessarily a conclusion. I think we got this one through and it will live as an informational EIP. But it really, it brought into question, you know, if there is significant development of specifications in other places, where should the EIPs stand? Should they be reference and pointers to these things, or should they not really be brought in at all? Some of the other larger R&D efforts right now, for example, stateless Ethereum, and yeah, stateless Ethereum being the big one. This probably will crop up again, and I think we should kind of figure out the relationship between some of these external spec repos and EIPs. So over here, yeah, years of spec development iteration, needed a more dynamic home than the EIPs. We brought in the most relevant details. Is it the proper trade-off? I don't know. I don't really know if I'm going to weigh in too much on that conversation. The EIP editors will probably have fun with that. But I think it's a reasonable trade-off. So here we are. So specification, no breaking consensus changes to existing Ethereum. We're bootstrapping proof of stake in parallel. And what we're doing here is bringing in some of the more relevant, especially to the community. There's a lot of like fine details in the specification, like how are validators managed in the state, how is hashing happen, what are the granular of state transition function, like what is a valid operation, all sorts of stuff. That probably isn't too important for penalty parameters, genesis time, that kind of stuff. The deposit contract, the things, and some of these subsections, we get into these. What we tried to do here was expose some of the high-level concerns that community members and people that aren't too familiar with the ETH2 specs, things that they might want to think about and be able to talk about and reference. And so that's what we did here. You know, the release version, a commit deposit contract, minimum genesis time, that's a Unix time. That's December 1st, 12 p.m. UTC. And then some values with respect to rewards and penalties. And then we go in and we talk about how there's the deposit contract that becomes kind of the interface into this new proof of stake chain, and how people need to think about making those deposits. And then, let's see, kind of the high level mechanics about the fact that there is this system level chain, the beacon chain, there are validators, consensus participants akin to miners, and they have roles and rights and responsibilities with respect to this. And then really reference more some of the granular specs on it all. And then I think something that's very relevant to the community we brought in here is the discussion of issuance. The intention here being to bootstrap the proof of stake protocol in parallel to the existing chain. And thus there actually being issuance both to miners and to proof of stake validators for some amount of time in parallel. noting that the total issuance in proof of stake is much lower than proof of work, and needs to be made explicit so that community members and other developers that are kind of interpreting and trying to understand how this works get a good handle. This is parameterized by the base reward factor, so it's kind of a configuration that's set, and this dictates those rewards. It's something that can obviously be debated. This is from Consensus Codify. They have a great spreadsheet, and it's linked to here, the E2 or Consensus Activate, sorry, E2 calculator, check it out. That just shows, based on total stake, kind of what's the max validator issuance and total ETH that could be issued. And then there's also there's links to technical papers scattered throughout here. So like here's a more technical discussion on like the issuance curve, which scales with the square root of the total validator set instead of like linearly or flat. And there's some cool discussion about discouragement, which you can check out in that paper. Then I won't go into understanding of the EIP and how it's structured rather than all the nitty-gritty details. One thing that is kind of interesting here is that there are these punitive parameters in the specifications which dictate how much validators are punished, especially in some of the tail risk scenarios, like when they do something explicitly nefarious or when a large portion of them are offline. And these have been chosen to be slightly less punitive 5 months of the protocol, because there are kind of early adopter risks, and it can be quite discouraging to come into this new system when there's really not an incredible amount at risk in terms of like what the proof of stake network is validating at that time. But there's probably a lot to lose if you have technical issues. And so there's a discussion here about modifying some of these constants to be less punitive. So there's actually a little bit less security margin because of that at V2, but with the intention here to up these to their kind of full security parameters once things are stable. So those are kind of the really relevant portions for discussion, but you dig a little bit deeper than that and you go into the ETH2 specs repo, and there's a lot to dig in, debate, discuss, and reason about. Cool. Here's a little slide. It's probably not too relevant. The specs repo is kind of detailed, very dynamic collaboration. There's a lot of tests and there's extensibility. We'll be using them for subsequent phases. Although the specs are public, anyone can participate. The EIP is really more of a public statement. It's a public place. It's static, and it really kind of hosts the important details for review. But again, I don't know the relationship between specs and EIPs and what they should be, but this is how we're using it today. We'll see. And the rest, there's a number of these other sections. The rationale, the backwards compatibility discussion, implementation. Too. There is an incredible amount of work done in all of these components before the EIP existed. There's this design rationale doc. There's an annotated spec, which goes into kind of the detail. There's actually 2 annotated specs, Ben Edgington's and Vitalik Buterin's, which go into the nitty-gritty detail of all the different things. Very interesting for a person like myself, but you can open up and see it if you find the same. So again, rationale has kind of been exported out of the EIP and just referenced here. Backwards compatibility, it's informational. There's no substantive change to the existing Ethereum. Compatibility issues here, but with kind of an intention to have some backwards incompatibilities based upon this in the future. Implementation, there's a lot of implementations. There's 4 or 5 that are near production ready, but there's been a number along the way. I think there's maybe 3 that died that had valiant lives, but eventually were deprecated. And there's a couple that are up and coming. And there's formal verification of that bytecode. There's also like tons of other stuff, lots of implementations and work around this. And then consider security considerations. This is not exhaustive, and I should probably like actually go through here with a fine-tooth comb and add more things. But there's a number of papers. There's these FAQs I mentioned. There's a research compendium. So a lot of it's kind of bundled into that. There's been a number of audits. Actually, since I put this up, there's been probably like 5 more audits released of clients and implementations. There is a lot of formal verification work, runtime verifications, done a lot of cool stuff here, both on the deposit contract and on some of the security properties of the protocol. And there's a number of bug bounty programs, of which the rewards are pretty high. I recommend, I need to update this link because this is released and these 2 are deprecated. Thank you. I'm glad to be reviewing this right now. But the bug bounty program is live. That's at eth2bounty.ethereum.org. And I think critical vulnerabilities are currently worth like $50,000. So again, find some vulnerabilities. Copyright and citation. I didn't write this, so I presume that it was auto-generated. Let's see. So something that I was asked about before, and it actually got the gears turning because I realized that it's probably time to update this. At the top, we have the status, and it's a draft. Drafts can be merged once they kind of fit the minimum standards. By a wider audience. We've kind of, in terms of the wider audience, we probably had some review during the draft for the wider audience. And then the final, and this skips some of the, this is a shorter sequence than core and some of the other EIPs statuses, sorry, EIP types. But then once we've had last call for 2 weeks, any technical changes have been addressed, then we can move into final. And so given when we first had this draft merge, we didn't actually have the final specifications released on the specs repo, but about 2 weeks ago, we did release those and put a reference in here. Like right here, version 1.0.0, a spec release commit. And so and then we will call it final. We'll have the 5th informational EIP ready, and that will be Genesis of ETH2. This proof of stake mechanism that we're bootstrapping is a little bit dependent on getting a threshold of deposits in. So the earliest that can happen is December 1st, so this might be final right about then, but in terms of when once we hit that threshold. That's my presentation. You can follow me on Twitter. Here's a link to the EIP. Here's a link to the specs. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. That was a great presentation, Danny. So one of the things that was there in your last slide, I have one question about that. I'm not actually a question. It's some change that I would like to highlight here.
Yeah.
About the statuses, there is another status called review that has been added recently. It's now available.
Oh, okay.
So I mean, like, yeah, it's up to you if you would like to create a pull request to change it to review, or maybe to the last call, because we have like less than 2 weeks for genesis of this. So
right,
we would want to go ahead with that.
Right. So reviews in here. Oh, there it is.
So this is something new that
gotcha.
Came out of the EIP like a process improvement group. We recently have made 2 changes. One on this part, which is relevant for the informational EIP, the process and the different statuses, and the other part, which may not be relevant for informational but for core EIP, is the we separated the network upgrade process from the EIP standardization. So there is a blog on Cat Headers Medium about that. I'll add the link in the description section for people who would like to follow.
Gotcha. So I would say that probably 2 weeks ago when we cut these version 1 releases, we probably should have moved it to review, and then right about now should have moved it from review to last call. So I might skip that one this time. But I also am realizing that EIP 1011 should probably get moved to stagnant, or is there maybe withdrawn. Yeah. I should probably move 1011, which has been deprecated for multiple years now, to withdrawn.
Right.
Yeah, I had a question. Are we ready now?
Yeah, please.
It's kind of a governance question, but early on you talked about we need to be able to, if there's a nefarious actor and if he does something nefarious, being able to prove that that's nefarious. And then it sounded like you were talking about some human making a decision to, after that's been proved, to burn some ether or something like that. Is that all automated, or is there some kind of human?
Automated. So in many attack scenarios in proof of stake, essentially an attack scenario is attempting to sign messages or create two conflicting chains. And this is because we use the validators all have like a public key that's known, and they cryptographically sign these messages. It's very distinct and provable what is nefarious at types of attacks. And so in the protocol, there is the ability to include these slashings, what we call slashings, on chain. So a block proposer could find something that looked slashable, or that was slashable from another validator, could include it on chain, at which point, depending on the severity of the effects they might have brought to the network, some amount of capital will be burned, and the proposer gets a small finder's fee. And so there's an incentive.
So talking about the staked cash or the staked ether is what's being burned.
Yes. So like you can think of it as like a collateral. Not only am I committing this with proof of work, I'm kind of dedicating some economic resource, the mining hardware and energy, to the protocol, and that kind of gives me my weight. Yep. Whereas, but you can't do anything to that mining hardware if they were evil. Whereas in proof of stake, economic resource is actually in protocol. It's kind of a security bond, and that if they do something nefarious, not only can you reward them for doing good behaviors, but you can penalize in the event that there are explicitly bad behaviors.
And that's all in the consensus building. A node detects that, and the whole system just automatically burns that stuff through the process with no human.
Correct.
Cool.
Correct.
Cool,
although if somebody sent me a letter that told me, had a cryptographic message that somebody had done something slashable, I could load that into my machine and handle it. But usually it happens on the gossip network.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I had a quick question, Danny.
Yep.
So one thing that kind of came up a little bit during the pull request is we talked a little bit about how all the specification for ETH2 was kind of in this, repo outside the Ethereum specification. And some factions of the community think that print out all of the EIPs and the yellow paper, take it to a remote island and develop, a fully mainnet compatible client. And, with phase 0 not really affecting how the mainnet happens today, eventually there will be a point where mainnet Ethereum begins to use the beacon chain as its consensus node. See us coming together on Ethereum. And this is also something that I've seen happen a lot in the last month or so, just how people are kind of trying to avoid saying ETH2, because that, makes it seem like there's some sequentiality behind this, but really these are the same protocols.
Right. How do I imagine the actual unification of the protocols, or how the unification of this kind of the specifications?
I think, more on the specification, the unification of the protocols, we can figure that out.
Yeah. So I don't know, and I think that there's probably some things to discuss and ponder here, because like I mentioned, there's, and maybe I'm mistaken. There's kind of some more radical upgrades that are wanted to be handled in the move to statelessness, which is kind of like a major upgrade to more of the execution and state layer of Ethereum, developed an independent repo, but they might be parsed out into individual EIPs. But if not, then they might end up in the same place where they're kind of pointers. And I don't know. I don't have the answer. Maybe the answer is that when it does become a core EIP and essentially is the point of merge, maybe at that point, I mean, at that point, we're going to see less rapid upgrades. And maybe at that point, it makes sense to kind of drop it into an EIP. But even then, it's very nice to have a repo with tests and an independent place to like talk about this component of the Ethereum protocol. So I don't know. I mean, I'm open to suggestions. I hadn't pondered it very much before this EIP and pondered the relationship between the two. And so you as an editor might have process than I do.
I mean, yeah, it's a really complicated problem, and I don't think that there is a simple solution. And you know, and that's the thing. Like until it comes to the point where Ethereum mainnet is actually being affected by this new protocol, this new consensus mechanism, it's going to be difficult to get everybody to actually. And
Right.
I don't know if you could also expand on like what you had mentioned earlier. This is an informational EIP, and that basically means that it's just trying to gain some consensus with the community and to share this information. But this isn't necessarily something that you needed to do. You guys could have just shipped ETH2 without even working through the ETH process at all. And you could have said, here, this is it. And in a year or two, we're going to take mainnet and put it in. And at that point, we'll go.
For one, I mean, operating in an independent spec repo is like, at least with respect to how things have been done, is like kind of rogue, and doesn't really fit into whatever the core process of Ethereum is. And so this was like an attempt to kind of bring it back. I think, again, operating in this independent repo has been very beneficial. But one reason is just kind of like bring it. People are putting real capital on the line to bootstrap this proof of stake consensus before it's really unified with the current Ethereum protocol. And so obviously an informational EIP is it's not a promise. You know, no one's promising anything to anyone, but we do have something that people have reviewed, people have discussed, people have had a chance to kind of get their rebuttal, and that when we do attempt to unify these two systems, we can kind of point to say like, yes, we've been intending to do it. Yes, it's been part of the conversation. And so that was one of the motivations here. Yeah. So again, yeah, maybe that's not the use of EIPs. Maybe like EIPs should be used for specifications and shouldn't be used as like signals. And whereas, you know, my explanation just now was more of like, well, we use it as a signal.
Yeah, I don't think there's a right answer, but you know, I appreciate like all of the work that these upgrades happen and the openness in which you like share this sort of information with the community. And if there was the right answer, I think that you guys were pretty close by publishing this EIP and trying to bring it back together with what's happening on mainnet right now.
Thanks.
I mean, it might be worth adding also that with ETH2, we're looking at something that is unique sort of in the EIP. I guess the vector of the changes that are being brought up and it really aren't replicated currently by anything else that's really happened in the scope of EIPs. So the fact that there's not a neat silo for it to fit into in the scope of like how we publish these things is probably a bit to be expected. I mean, your point that this is probably going to be an ongoing thing with stateless is well put. I think indicate that we need to put thought into how to handle these sort of like overarching concepts.
And maybe it would have been clearer for like what we could have done is designed the entirety of ETH2 and at the flip of a switch, gone from proof of work to proof of stake, governed by this totally new consensus mechanism. And that would have been would have been more clearly a core EIP. Still, you would have had the debate as to whether you actually dump the entirety of the spec in the EIP or not. But I think it would have been a little bit more clear cut about the relationship between the specs and the Ethereum protocol. But I also think my opinion is that that would not be a smart thing to do, not a prudent thing to do for this.
Probably fair. If you could go back 3 years ago, is there anything that you would do differently in terms of signaling what this upgrade means? Like, would you have tried to stray from calling it Ethereum 2? Would you have focused on saying this is Serenity? Or would you?
Yeah, so Ethereum, if I've given a couple talks recently about the terms ETH1, the terms ETH2, and that it's useful to think about them as something separate, but it's not useful to think about them as something sequential, in the sense that if you go back and look at the original roadmap, you had this thing called Serenity. And what is Serenity? Serenity was upgrading the core consensus. And what is ETH2? It's an attempt to upgrade the core consensus. And so, yeah, if we would have called it Serenity from the beginning, I think it would have been more clear the relationship between these things. And even now, I'm trying to find maybe to discuss the difference between these things. So, like, we have what we call the ETH2O specs repo, but it's not really the ETH2O specs repo, in my opinion. It's more like the ETH proof of stake specs repo, or sharded proof of stake specs repo. It's the ETH future consensus repo. You know, what do we have with most of the EIPs so far? And what do we have with the stateless upgrade? It's really upgrades to the execution and user layer and application layer. And rather than it's like, we're trying to figure out how to come to consensus on things better. And when you're working in this other layer that we usually call ETH1, people are trying to come to consensus, like, what are they coming to consensus on? More interesting precompiles, state structures, and different things like that. And so ETH1 and ETH2 are more of layers rather than sequentiality. What would I have done differently? I would have conceived of that earlier on. To be honest, that this has been a journey, like, in how these specifications are being worked on and how the relationship between what we're building and existing Ethereum mainnet and the framing and how it all is related to each other has been an evolving thing in my own head and in the heads of other people working on this. And so I just would have told myself 2 or 3 years ago that it's a separation of layers. Everyone working on ETH1 is working on optimizing this layer. You're working on ETH2, so you're working on optimizing this layer. Why don't you call it something different, dummy?
That is a good point. I mean, we could debate like the semantics, all these things, but do you think that there is any functional effect on that we've called it ETH2 for so long? Or do you think that this is like a fun thought experiment to talk on a podcast that's going to be posted on YouTube?
I think that giving people the proper terms and framing can help people understand systems easier. And so by calling it ETH1 and calling this other thing ETH2 and saying they're going to, doesn't really give much, there's not much semantic meaning to those words. It doesn't really help anyone frame and think about the system. And so if we called it, ETH kernel and ETH user, or ETH consensus and ETH execution, and talked about them as different layers, I think there would be some value in just like, the faster you can get somebody up to speed on like the general structure, the faster you can get them up to speed on the next thing. And so framing is important in that respect. And we're also trying to like have people on board and understand these concepts, not just from a technical standpoint, but also from like a roadmap and community standpoint. And so if the less technical don't have the proper kind of analogies and framings and metaphors to be able to think about these things, it's really hard to like understand, oh, do I support ETH2? I don't know. Do I support upgrading Ethereum's consensus to be more sustainable, scalable, and still decentralized? Probably, yeah, that sounds to it.
Those are good points. Thanks for that, Danny.
Mhm.
Once again, thank you so much for your answer, Danny. And we are hitting almost allocated time for the show. But while we have you here with us, do you have anything to share about the Empowerment DevNet or maybe the ectogenesis that is coming on December 1st?
Yeah, so first of all, E2 Genesis may come on December 1st, depending on the amount of deposits that go into that deposit contract. There's this Genesis delay of 7 days. And so the threshold has to be hit 7 days before any day that Genesis would be. So if we are to have Genesis on December 1st, that means that about 10 of ETH deposits need to make it into this deposit contract by November 24th. So something to keep in mind. There's a lot of other movement going on. We're working on ETH2 merge R&D. We're working on data availability stuff to get a more scalable data availability layer. Working on light client capabilities in ETH2. A lot of like parallel exciting things happening. And tomorrow at 5 a.m. for this Piermont, which is a version 1 testnet of ETH2 phase 0 is launching. It's going to be launching entirely in the control of client developers, and then it will be opened up for the community to make deposits. So if you want to test your final setups before mainnet, check it out. Piermont. There'll probably be some noise on Twitter and stuff tomorrow. You can make some deposits.
Great. I hope this to be a successful Genesis because you guys have already done a lot of testnets before this. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.
For people watching us on YouTube, hopefully today's episode answers some of your questions related to ETH2. And if you still have any questions, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below. You may find the Twitter handle of the guest and rest of the participants of this meeting in the description section, along with the resources that is shared in the meeting today. To participate in ETH2 discussion, join ETH2 R&D server. Invite link is not provided in this description to avoid spammers, but it is available on other public channels. You're also welcome to drop by Ethereum Cat Herders Discord and say hello. And the next EIP on the show that we will be talking about is the EIP-2982, and our guest will be Felix Long. If you like this EIP focus series, share it with other community members and let them know about Peep. Do hit like, share, and subscribe to Ethereum Cat Herders channel. We'll be back soon with another proposal. Till then, keep sharing your love with Cat Herders. This is your host, Pooja Ranjan. Thank you everyone for joining. Cheers.
Thanks everyone. It was awesome. Bye.